So today I wanted to talk about apathy, in particular, apathy in the context of the political. Now, I don't want you to assume that I mean the complete dismissal of the political or that I'm talking about checking out of politics altogether. I'm not. What I am describing though is a emotional apathy to the political. This is what I believe occurs when someone is involved in this for a very long time. They sort of reach a state of maturation where they're no longer emotional about these things. They're very cool-headed, and that can lead to them having a clearer understanding, but oftentimes it will lead them into conflict with others who don't have this sort of apathetic response, and it leads to a sort of discrepancy between people who share the same ideals often. I've noticed this in myself, and this is why I'm making this video. I've seen other people allude to this concept, but I've never seen really anyone flesh it out. So just to make things clear, we need to first understand what apathy is. Obviously, it's the lack of emotion towards the political in the context of this video. Now, I want to say this, and Pareto says this as well. Ideas and ideology isn't something that's reasoned first and then emotion is attached to it. Rather, emotion appears to us and then we rationalize the emotion into our idea or ideology. Now, rationalists don't like to hear this because to them, this implies that we don't really have access to the truth. We just have access to making sense of our emotions. But I disagree with that. I think our emotions are the response to the real and true things out in the world. For example, if you have a negative emotion in response to seeing mass immigration, it's because mass immigration is a real thing in the world, and you identifying it as a real thing in the world and then rationalizing why it's a problem based off that initial emotional response doesn't in any way undermine the validity of that concern. The emotion is reflexive of a deeper sort of will that's rather unconscious that we later see first in emotion and then come to fully understand through reasoning through it. So I think that's how that works. But typically what happens though is over time you start to realize that since politics is made up of multiple interests, yours, your friends, which are defined by being those with the same interest, and your enemies, which is defined by those who have the complete opposing interest. Once you realize this, you start to not even hold resentment toward those groups that oppose your interest. You almost understand them in a way. You, of course, don't stop holding your interest. Now, I want to sort of draw out a almost political phenomenology for you. There is this group of people, they're doing this bad thing, there's a bad phenomena occurring. I have an emotional response to this. I feel morally outraged towards them. I reason why this is the case. I still view them as the enemy in a almost mythological sense. And then there's a later phase where you begin to understand that yes, they are the enemy, but if I were them, I would also do what they are doing, and I can't blame them for doing what they're doing. Now, this is where people may make a mistake. They may realize this truth, become sort of apathetic, but then forget where they stand in all of this. They may not understand that, well, you can't blame yourself either for not wanting them to win because you are you and not them. And that's sort of the final stage, almost like a form of political absolute knowing, if you will. A sort of, well, politics is just defined by the movement of interests throughout history, and I'm part of these interests. I'm one aspect of it, and I'm going to conform to that because it's my reality. To do otherwise would be to contradict myself. So that is what political apathy is. And I think I really came to know this rigorously, arguing with people who I consider friends about the JQ. Now, these were people who held the JQ as true for many, many years, but as it got more popular, as all things do, the sort of high quality form of the JQ was degraded over time. And to the more, for lack of a better term, intellectually aware or astute or tutored maybe, this is obviously very revolting. And I understand that. There's nothing worse than seeing good ideas turned into something that's poorly thought out and argued. And if that happens too much, it almost becomes a different idea altogether. If you deviate too much from the original form, you end up creating a new thing. So it's understandable why people would sort of be revolted by vulgar forms of this idea in particular. But the mistake with thinking like that would be to then conclude it's not true, or we should abandon it because the wrong people are using it and turning it into something it was never supposed to be. And that's a mistake because at the end of the day, the reason we hold on to the idea such as the JQ is because it's in our interest to do so. Ultimately, the JQ is a product of ourselves recognizing our interest and its juxtaposition to another interest. And I've explained this to friends of mine. I said, look, it's not that I hold any resentment in a emotionally charged sense, if you will, will. It's more that I understand that we are both fighting to survive and control power and resources, etc. And I understand why they're doing what they are doing, and I don't blame them for doing what they're doing. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to pursue what's in my interest, which is juxtaposed to theirs. So that's the difference. The difference is I can understand why someone does something, and I almost don't blame them for doing it. But at the end of the day, I can't blame myself for wanting to do what is in my interest either, because to do otherwise would be to contradict my identity, my essence. And likewise, if we all held to that opinion, it would be a collective form of self-denial to not put our own interest at front and center just because we recognize the interest of others as existing. What I wanted to bring it back to is the apathetic approach. I think this approach that I have is much more cool-headed and helps you understand things in a way where you're not going to spurg out, so to speak, or lose yourself in the sort of inferno of your own emotions. Now, I'm not completely against emotion. I think emotion is almost posterior to reason, but you have to understand it's a stepping stone. It's not the last or the only thing you should be mired within. And most people who are emotional obviously don't really know they are emotional. I mean, they do, but like not really. They would never accept the labeling as them being so. If you're able to maintain the idea and also take a sort of cool-headed, laid-back approach and understand things in a sort of almost impersonal approach, even though it is deeply personal on a ontological level, right? Because it involves me and my life and the life of my loved ones and the life of your loved ones. So it is personal, but if you can treat it as if it were impersonal for your own sake and clear-headedness, I think you would be better off doing so, and so would we all. But see, this is the thing, and I don't want this to come off as me saying I'm better than anyone else, but it's not easy for people to do that without necessarily losing sight of the goal or the matter at hand. So I'm not going to completely shame somebody for having emotion or discredit them for having emotion or say to them you're being too emotional about this, even though they may be too emotional about it. I just do think that this political apathy is a sign of maturation in many people.